Hey everyone, I am Dr. Aaron Wheeler,
And I'm Dr. Matt Cook.
and this is Missio Pop, a podcast on popular missiology where two overeducated white dudes talk about all things in the culture of missions and God's hope for the world.
This first season, we're focusing on the task of contextualization, the way in which culture shapes and forms the way we share God's truth. We're so glad you're here.
Welcome back, everyone, to the 10th and final episode of season 1 of Missio Pop. Dr. Matt Cook, we're at the end. How are you feeling?
It's crazy, man.
I know.
We've met like one time, and here we are. We've almost completed an entire podcast together.
I feel like that has been the story behind the story that our listeners haven't picked up on entirely, is how much we are actually getting to know each other in the process of this. Because we met one time in Nashville, maybe a few months before we launched this podcast. It was Dr. Lauren Pinkston that set us up and said we'd make a good team. And you know what? I think she was right.
I think she was.
Yeah.
It's been fun.
Yeah, it has been a joy to co-host this with you. You've been a great person to work with. I've enjoyed our time together. I think I've done like interviews and other things with other people at times, and it's always hard to know when they're going to jump in and when you're going to speak, and if you're going to compliment one another. I've been in situations where that hasn't happened, and so that has not been the case with you. It's been a joy.
Yeah,
enjoyed
it's been a ton of fun until today, Aaron.
Right,
You
right.
suggested that let's do this at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Yeah,
I can't be really responsible for what comes out today. I've got my coffee. I'm starting on my coffee right now, but yeah, this is early. This is an early one. Did I hear you say that a minute ago that you stopped and got coffee?
Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Oh, okay.
That's how it is when we're gonna have to be, on at 7 a.m. You have to do some things. You have to make some choices. That's
Okay.
part of contextualization. Is if the situation requires it, then you do what you got to do.
You're right.
I'm doing some meta level teaching here,
Yeah.
and that's what it's all about. But yeah, this is our. We thought we'd do something new for our last episode, have an early morning recording. But we're both fathers. We're used to early mornings. This
Yeah.
is not new.
Yeah. Oh,
Did you know that fun fact back in the day?
Go ahead.
The fun fact back in the day, Ozark Christian College used to have 7 a.m. classes.
When I started here 10 years ago at Free Hardeman, as the rookie, I got the 7:30.
Oh,
7:30 class. That was it. It was couple of years, I think, and then they finally got rid of them.
Yeah.
It was me and a bunch of baseball players, because the athletes like the early classes because they've got practices in the afternoon, so they can knock their classes out early. So it tended to be a lot of athletes, which I love our athletes, but a lot of them not a lot of them. There's a handful of them. Then they get here, they're like, oh, this is really a Christian school. Like, I've got to take a Bible class every semester and go to chapel every day. So they're in for surprises. So that's kind of fun. But yeah, now the only thing we offer now is we have an occasional 8 o'clock class. And I've discovered that the 8 o'clock classes, and I teach one about every semester, used to draw like a lot of athletes, and they're great, love them. But now it tends to draw the best students because you've got to be a pretty good student to decide, I'm going to take an 8 o'clock class.
Sure.
And the really terrible students, I mean, like we may have been when we were in college. No, they're saying no way to an 8 o'clock class.
Right.
Anyway.
No, I found the same reality with our winter sessions, where you have to come back a week early from Christmas break and do an intensive class over 5 days. That there tended to be a higher level of student who would do that, because otherwise, I can stay at home and sleep in and watch Netflix and, be a college kid.
Yeah.
So the student who's going to make that sacrifice tends to be a higher level, and you're dealing with a different crop of students in that winter session. But we have to land this plane today. We have to come to the end. We are continuing in part 2 of how to contextualize well. Last week, we looked at 1 and 2. Number 1 is you've got to learn, you've got to resource yourself. We walked through a lot of books. I'm sure that was thrilling for all of our listeners, both of them. Yeah. And in case you didn't get that, there is a list on the episode itself with links to the books that we have. To those who gather royalties from that, you're welcome. And then we looked at number 2, which is that let me go to my notes to see what we actually said. Know your perspective, that you have to go through your own process of contextualization, your own sifting to understand yourself and where you came from and why you are the way that you are. That's a real big deal and is a whole process and is not usually fun, but it is necessary. Our model for this is, of course, Peter himself in Acts 10, who has to go through his own conversion before the conversion of Cornelius. And then today, number 3. Matt, why don't you tell us about number 3?
Yeah, we've got to, and this is the obvious one, right? We've got to learn their perspective. In other words, we've got to be open and consider other worldviews, specifically whatever worldview we're ministering in. We've got to learn where they're coming from, and that takes a lot of work, doesn't it?
It does. It takes a lot of work, but I think the good news is that, if number 1 was all this reading academic textbooks on anthropology and worldview, that isn't how we would recommend going to number 3. That it really is kind of it can be a fun process of learning. It can be a fun process of opening up, because usually academic textbooks are not the best way. This can be a lot of different things. One of the things I'd recommend is local novels. Like, what is in your target audience and the people group you're working with, could be a generation, could be an age group, whatever distinction that is, to learn how they tell stories. Learn not only what their main narratives are, but how they go about telling narratives as well. What their stories are, what are their key stories of how they see themselves, and then the method of which they do that storytelling is a huge piece of this.
Yeah, and if you can do that in their language, especially, which you would have to, but if we're dealing with another language, then yeah, you're really going to immerse yourself into another language, another culture. I've discovered just recently some novels that are written with the purpose of understanding other cultures. It's a brand new book by David Parks. He's a professor at Samford, Beeson Divinity School, called Armand's Freedom, and his goal was to write a novel that would help his students understand Middle Eastern culture and the process that someone goes through when they come to Jesus. And this is going to sound crazy. We talked about this last session. I'm cutting Hebert's Anthropological Insights for Missionaries from my missionary culture, or my cultural anthropology class, and I'm adding this semester.
Okay.
Just as a way to help people learn, or help the students learn about other cultures, but through a novel. Anyway, side note, those people are doing some different stuff these days. It's kind of fun.
Yeah. So the power of a narrative, the power of story, novels are a great way to do that. And most cultures we're working with around the world have a long past, much longer than ours. And so there are key stories, key texts that have shaped them and shaped how they understand the world and how they understand truth. And so read those things. They're usually pretty good. And that can be a big way that we understand their perspective. And as you're, have a conscious mind in the process. Don't just get lost in the story. Ask yourself, how are we understanding good and evil? How are we understanding right and wrong? What does a hero look like? What is the protagonist described as? And in a lot of ways, how does the story end? Because in most cultures around the world, we don't have happy endings. We don't have this, hero's journey where the person continues to grow and then conquers their enemies and rides off into the sunset. That is our way of telling stories. And so when that is subverted, there's a great learning experience that can happen there.
Yeah. And it's not just from books that you learn these stories. You can learn these stories from the visual arts, like movies and television. In fact, some people might prefer to watch the movie instead of read the book.
Sure.
That's one of the challenges for anybody in another culture, is to, especially in the age of the internet and everything's online, you got to turn off the American TV and English Netflix, and you got to turn on some local TV and watch some local movies, and watch movies, especially movies and television shows from that particular culture.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about turn the Spanish language on Netflix and watch your American movies. Though you can, again, that's not a bad. It's better than watching it in English and trying to learn Spanish. But you get to see and visualize the way they're going to tell stories, and for a lot of people, that's easier even to do that.
Yeah,
with
and that's a struggle. You want that comfort level, especially if you're going through culture shock and you're in your first season, and you just want something that feels normal and real. That, you know, what we watch and what we consume can be that comforting thing, and we got to resist that on some level. I'm not saying don't watch the thing,
yeah.
but
I'm a
make a commitment.
hypocrite here.
Yeah,
I did not do great at this. That's why I'm looking back and saying I wish I would have watched more Peruvian movies and television.
and it's funny because even if it's just turning on the local television, there's a lot to be learned, like how they do advertisements and how, you know, they handle commercial breaks and
Yeah.
newscasting, and there's just
Yeah.
culture happening all around you if you're willing to watch and observe and consume. And I think even when it comes to movies, you know, asking the question like, what was the most popular movie in the last 5 years? That even if it's a movie that you wouldn't like, even if it's not your style, there's a lot to be learned of why did this hit a nerve? Why was this popular? What does it say about the local place that of all the types of movies they created, this was the one that people most connected with? There's a lot
Yeah.
to be learned in that process.
Hmm. And then you got to learn some history
Oh
of
yeah.
your local place. You got to read. Some of that'll come up in movies, but if you're in a place where you've got some museums, or if you need to go to the capital city, wherever, go to the
Yeah.
museums, learn their history and the way that they tell their history. That's going to be huge.
Yeah, because that's another form of narrative. History is a story, and how we shape that story over time, how we understand, you know, what's happened in the last 500 years, 50 years, 5 years to get us to the place that we are is going to help you understand the people and their perspective. And so that can be, you know, historical movies, that can be, you know, nonfiction historical memoirs and accounts of people. It can be going to museums, it can be lots of different places to understand why people are where they're at this particular place in time. Like our current time is a context, and we have to understand what brought us to that context.
Right. We lived in Cusco, Peru, and I could walk there in about 20 minutes, but if I got a taxi, 3 or 4 minutes to the ancient temple of the
Mm.
Incan Indians, um, which was really cool. Like, and it was these big stones. It was so cool. But yeah, so we had to go, and of course, a lot of these places are museums now and learn their history. Um, and then you shape your ministry around some of those,
Yeah.
like the way they think, and the like. I never forget that we learned early on like the three rules of the Incans, were kind of these three ethical commandments, almost sounded 10 commandments ish. um and so we played off of those some because the people knew them, like they learned them from their childhood even though they were 500 years old. So yeah, you gotta learn from their history in the museums.
And I would add to that that, you know, in this story of history, it's important to learn like where are we at this point? As in, is this a season of increase or a season of decrease? Is this a time where things are getting better or a time where things are getting worse? And historically, why and what has led to that? And how do people view this current place and time? And I would also especially add, when we're looking at cross cultural situations, that's usually what we're talking about right here, is what is the history of your people within this place? So whether it's, you know, Westerners, whether it's Americans, whether it's, you know, male versus female, what is the history of your particular foreign group coming in? What does that relationship look like? Has it been as, you know, conquerors? Has it been as exploiters? Has it been a negative or a positive thing? To understand that when the local people look at you, they're looking at your history as well, and to understand what are the positive, negative strengths and weaknesses of that.
Absolutely. And how they observe like American politics. So
Yeah.
part of my time in Peru, Obama was the president, and for the variety of reasons, I think people across the globe loved him.
Hmm.
Like Peruvians just thought he was awesome. They didn't know anything about him.
Yeah.
They just thought that doesn't look like the typical American president. So they're like, "Your president's Obama. That's awesome." So like knowing that, I think is significant
Hmm.
in the context of cross cultural situations.
Yeah. Also, we would recommend getting into the culture. I know that's a weird thing to say, but we're talking about people, traditions, eating, celebration, how life is lived. Look at how people do these things. So, whatever the big holiday that's coming up, because my experience, I'm sure yours is the same, is that in other cultures, there seems to be a lot more holidays. They
Yeah.
seem to have a lot of weird traditions and history behind them, and celebrations can be a lot or a little, just depends. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of things out there.
And there's so many, and you need a calendar so you know what's going on. Or
Yep.
for very practical purposes, you're going to go out on a day thinking this is a normal day and I'm going to get work done. And you
Right.
go out and everything is closed and nothing has happened. That happened to us a time or two. We're like, oh, this is a normal work day. And like we walk to work and there's nobody there. Like nobody's out, nobody's doing anything. And we could have had a day off, but we didn't know it was a holiday.
Yeah, it's important to be aware. And how did that holiday come about? What's the story behind it? Who are the heroes and traditions? You know, usually these have a narrative focus of some dude who did something in some place, and now we celebrate. And so, learning what those stories are, and what I
And
found
how
in
they
my go ahead.
well, and how they celebrate them. This is why relationships are so important. Don't wait for your first Bible study. Like develop relationships with your neighbors, ask them questions.
Yeah,
And in most cultures, hospitality is viewed in a different way than it is here. And so you're going to invite your neighbors in a lot of places. You will invite your neighbors, especially if they're strangers in that land. You can invite them in to be a part of holiday celebrations because you want to share your culture. We're terrible about that here in the United States, but in many places, people want to share their lives and their culture with you. And that could be your neighbors, that could be Christians that you've connected to along the way. There's so many ways, but you got to connect with people and develop relationships.
yeah, I think that's an important point to bring up because in the U.S., oftentimes we don't live near family. I think that's a relatively common thing, and so holidays are the time to bring the family together and kind of circle the wagons and make this a moment just for us. As to where in a lot of the rest of the world, you do live around your family, you see them all the time. And so holidays are the time to kind of open the doors and to bring other people and to show that invitation and hospitality. And so the opportunities to be in people's homes, to meet their families, to reach those deeper levels of intimacy at holidays are just greater. That was definitely our experience as well. We were in an academic environment, and so we're living on a campus, and that's kind of its own fake community, not fake community, but different kind of community because it's students and teachers and everything that supports a university. But when it would break down and when we'd see real life and real families and get into people's homes in a way that we wouldn't before is in the holidays because the university system shuts down in the holidays. And that's when other opportunities and other things arose that allowed us to do things that we never otherwise could have done.
Yeah, no doubt. So finding a cultural informant is important.
Yeah.
Maybe someone who's on the fringes of society, who's a part of that culture, but they still maybe they have a connection to your culture or is they're interested in your culture. Someone who can view from the outside but see things a little bit better than you. There was a guy in Peru. We had a friend named Marco, and he was Peruvian, but he was different.
Mm.
Uh, he didn't he didn't fit real well with Peruvians. He was drawn to Americans. Like he was always for years, like you could tell that he had always kind of been drawn to Americans, and that didn't make for a great like evangelistic sort of setting because he was just drawn to us because we were Americans. But he
Right.
made a great cultural informant because he was the guy that we could go to and say, "Hey, what's going on here?" He was educated, he was smart,
Mm.
just a little different, but made for a great cultural informant. If you can find somebody like that, that can really help you to understand what's going on in the culture.
Oh yeah, I mean those cultural informants are worth their weight in gold. They're like you said, fringe people. That's one of the things that I observed over time is that our best cultural informants were not your insiders. They were not your local heroes. They were not the people who necessarily were connected to everyone. They were kind of people on the outskirts, on the margins a little bit, for a lot of different reasons. Not necessarily because they lacked people skills or they lacked education. Sometimes they were kind of above the rest of the group. That I've known a cultural informant that the reason he was kind of on the outside is because he spent some time in the States studying at university. And so that kind of put him above the rest of the group and also marginalized him. And so that's what they have in common is they're on the fringes, and that gives them a unique place to observe both who you are as an outsider because they're a little bit about themselves, but then also why the culture is the way it is. When you're so deep in a culture, when you're so saturated in it, you can't observe it well. It's oftentimes like our families of origin. We're so deep into our families of origin that we can't really see it for what it is as to where other people can. It's like, when you get married and your spouse has an opportunity to view your family of origin, they'll notice things and they'll see things that you don't because they're an outsider coming in and that gives them a level of observation. And so cultural informants are often in those margins, they're just outsiders for a certain reason. and they can observe and they can understand. We had, a few people that we worked with in Asia that were that way as well, that they so many times could explain things in a way that nobody else could. When something was going on, when a situation arose, and I'm baffled at what is happening or why this is the way it is, they could explain it. They could articulate it. They could say, oh, it's because this and this and this. And you're just like, that was brilliant. And I never would have gotten there on my own. And they also, I found a number of times, there was a guy in particular, his name was Steven, that was his English name. He would often notice when I was making assumptions. He would notice when I was missing larger pieces because the area of the culture, the strata of society that I was dealing with had its own unique thing that was not normal for the rest of the country. And when I was making assumptions on the whole nation, because of the specific part of that nation I worked with, he would correct me. And I really, really appreciated that. He was saying, no, you work with this group and that's why you think we are this way, but that is not normal and you need to correct it. And he was just brilliant in helping me along the way.
Yeah. We haven't directly talked a lot about like communication and contextualization because it's so
Mm.
obvious. Anytime you communicate, you're contextualizing. But I found that these cultural informants can really help you if you're struggling to figure out how to say something or tell a story, or even just as simple as like, here, look over my notes for this sermon I'm going to
Mm.
preach. Um, they can help you to say things in a way that make more sense in that culture.
Yeah.
The turns of phrases that you don't know yet, um, those cultural informants help with that too.
Yeah. What do you think is necessary to find a cultural informant? This isn't in our notes, so we're flying solo here. What have you noticed in the cultural informants you've encountered? Was there any commonalities of how to find them, how to engage with them? Because they're so important for
I'm
navigating
going to
these
take the
things.
easy way out and totally say that God's going to send them to you. The guy that I've just been talking about, he literally, we had planted this church. We kind of had our launch service, worship service. Of course, we're dealing with completely different culture than you did with it when in Asia. So we advertised day one, all this advertising, 230 people show up. The next Sunday, 30 people show up, which again, I get recognized as totally different from anywhere else, a lot of places in the world. And so Marco was walking by, and I'll never forget, I was kind of standing at the door. It was early, we were probably 20 minutes before we were supposed to start, and nobody's going to show up until 15 minutes late anyway. And like he peeked his head in and he said, "Can I come in?" He saw a sign for our worship service or something. I said, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "Well, how much does it cost?" And I
Hmm.
said, "Dude, nothing. You're good." And he came, and then he became like one of our core people that served. It took him a long time to become a follower. He eventually did, but I just say that God, he walked by our building, our location, and decided for what I think he saw Americans and thought,
Yeah.
"Oh, this could be cool," and then stuck it out. Yeah, so I think God sends these people to you
Oh,
because
absolutely. Yeah.
He knows we need them.
That's, clearly the most spiritual answer. And congratulations on you for
You're
going
welcome.
that
I
way
do what I
first.
can.
But yeah, in the same vein, I was shocked at how many times our best cultural informants were people that pursued us.
Hmm.
That, obviously there's the prompting of the Holy Spirit involved, no question. But I think part of being a French person is you're looking for community in ways that the most people are getting, but you're not. And so these foreigners, these other outsiders, are a potential place for a community that you wouldn't otherwise have. And so you take that initiative and you take that step and you're thinking, I can't really connect with, this group of people. So let me try this other one. And there's something unique. Yeah. A lot of times people, I think Americans don't realize how much we can be local celebrities simply by the fact that we're American. The
Yeah.
soft power of our movies and television and media that goes out to the entire world makes us, look like we came off of the silver screen when we go into places a lot of times. And so there's an attractional level of us just simply being American. And there's a place where people will pursue us because of that and come to us. And oftentimes those were the very people that we were looking for and that we needed. But another one that I noticed was as you're in communities and as you're looking around in places where people gather, those who are kind of on the outside, those who don't seem to be fitting in, don't seem to be connected. Sometimes they're too loud, sometimes they're too quiet. Whatever it is, that if you will take an opportunity to just go connect with that person and just pursue them a little bit, that you'll often find someone with a very unique perspective someone who can understand the local culture in a powerful way. That is a huge piece of learning and growing and understanding people.
Absolutely. And then we haven't said this, but it's pretty obvious. You just got to keep asking questions.
Yeah.
It's specifically why. Why is this happening? And so you ask your cultural informant, but that's obvious. And I think we've tried to emphasize that throughout. You're going to ask why.
Yeah.
Things are going on.
And that's the humility of being willing to look like the dumb person. That you're asking simple questions that nobody else asks because everybody else understands. And so you're willing to look like the idiot who's like, why are we doing this? I don't understand what this is. Yeah. Learn to be childlike in that way, that you're always asking that why. You're always wanting clarity. You're always wanting things understood. And people will think it's adorable because you look a bit like a simpleton, but that's okay. That's part of Christ-like humility, that we are willing to do that. And so this is a really big deal. You've got to learn who this group is, what they're about, what drives them, what motivates them, even to levels that they themselves may not understand because they haven't been asking the why. They just accept things for what they are. And I don't know if you ever ran into that situation where you would learn some things and you would pick up on some things and you try to, ask local people, because check if whether these conclusions you're making are correct or whether you understood this correctly. And so when you explain why you think things are the way they are, when you bring out your theories, that you get a mixed level of reactions to that. I think people don't want to be analyzed sometimes.
Right. And that's understandable because we don't want to be analyzed too, especially by an outsider, right? But yeah, I think you're absolutely right about continuing to ask those questions is the key. But yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. It's 7:40 just came up on my brain. I totally lost my train of thought. I knew it was going to happen at some point. You said something a minute ago that was like, yeah, that, and then it's gone now.
It's okay. It's okay. We're in our last one. If you've made it to episode 10, you're on board with us. So we can lower the expectations. And I think in the midst of this, it has to be stated that anytime you're in a cross-cultural situation, you're going to encounter things that you don't like. You're going to encounter things that you think are wrong, that you think shouldn't be done this way. And that's going to bring up what you feel is your need to criticize. And that's not advised. That generally people don't take criticism well, especially from an outsider, especially from someone who's not in the thing. And so I think you've got to find your place where criticism is safe. I'm not advising to just bury it and, put it deep and pretend it's not there. There does need to be a place to process. There does need to be a safe space for you to articulate how you're feeling, especially the negative emotions. But in the midst of this, going to local people and saying, why don't you fix this or why don't you do this differently, is generally not well received and not advised.
Yeah, and maybe we just, again, follow the example of Jesus. He was led to the slaughter and opened not his mouth. Perhaps even when we're mistreated, it's probably or we feel like something unjust has occurred, or we got overcharged because we're Americans for this taxi ride. I look back and I have a couple regrets of times that I tried to argue, stand for my rights, which again is a very American thing to do, to stand for your rights. But it doesn't usually turn out well as we try to demonstrate Jesus to people.
Yeah. I mean, we could get into a whole case study scenario of what is the difference between a tip and a bribe, but we won't do that.
No, we don't want
to. The sponsor for today's podcast is Ozark Christian College. Now, being that this is like my first podcast I've ever done, I don't know how these ads are supposed to work. I've always wondered, how do you talk about something that you really don't know about, but you have to suddenly be a salesman for? And I'm super glad that today I don't have to do that. Instead, I get to tell you about Ozark Christian College. Not only was this just a monumental part of my own life and calling and experience, but it is now the place where I get to serve and hopefully provide something similar to my students. And specifically, what I'm here to talk to you about today is the Master of Arts in Biblical Ministry with a concentration on strategic leadership. What this degree is all about is helping those who have a call to lead. That leadership can be in a variety of contexts, from churches to nonprofits to parachurch organizations. And the strategic leadership concentration will equip you to dive deep into God's word and learn from that what it means to lead God's people across generations, across cultures, into whatever God's kingdom calling is for them. If this interests you and you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to go and apply for free at occ.edu/masters.
How are things going? I mean, really going for your church post-COVID? At Kindred Exchange, we hope your congregation is thriving, that your people are connected to each other, your community is connected to your people, and all of these people are reaching the world with overflowing love and gospel impact. We have a hunch, though, because we are also a part of churches, that perhaps things are a bit messier than this. Over the last decade, we experienced new critiques to evangelism and American Christianity in a plurality of ways. Then, a global pandemic cultivated a natural break for many to step away from the faith community they had always known. We want to be a part of what's next for you. With the Mission Audit Weekend at Kindred Exchange, you'll gather with leaders from area churches to ask the tough questions about what's past, what's next, and what's best for the gospel to be an encouragement not only to your immediate neighbors, but to your neighbors across the globe. Through keynotes, facilitated workshops, and curated moments of networking and sharing, our team of mission experts will guide your church leadership through a 2-day assessment of your outreach programs and strategies. It's no secret that people are hungry for good news. Let's make sure we're using relevant approaches to help that good news be received as hope and light in a heavy, fast-changing world. If your church would like to be a city host, let us know. Or you can sign up for our next event taking place in Nashville on August 25th and 26th at www.kindredexchange.org/audits.
Step one is, of course, you got to learn. You've got to grow in your understanding of what contextualization is. Step two is that you've got to learn yourself. Step three is that you've got to learn them. So there's a lot of learning involved, a lot of experience, and we want to make sure that we're emphasizing that's experiential learning. We don't just simply want you to read books, but you want to get into things, use all of your senses to be a part of these things. That's where learning really happens. And then once all that is done, it's time to speak truth. But let me put a caveat on that. Speak truth in cooperation with the people you're working with. It's got to be a joint venture. It's got to be something that you work together. One of the great mistakes that we can make in contextualization is saying, okay, I've done the work of understanding myself. I've done the work of understanding you. And so now I'm at this place of authority. I'm at this place of I've arrived. We want to get prophetic a little bit and say, now that I know you and I know me, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And that's lacking that Christ-like humility, that desire to empty yourself, to have that servant's place, Philippians 2 stuff we're getting into here. Instead, we're making sure don't do this alone. Working with the local people in cooperation, hand in hand with them, walk together in how church is done, in how faith is lived, in how community is created, and how sermons are crafted. That all of this is done in cooperation with the people you've come to know and love and serve.
Yeah, and part of this is about trusting God to work through not just you, but through the people that you're with and that you're serving and that you're discipling. God's Spirit lives in them just as much as He lives in you, and He can work through them as much as He can work through you. And again, to not do that, I kind of want to be like, okay, obviously that's humility, but I think more than it's to not do that is just a really big pride problem.
Yeah.
And we struggle with that as outsiders, and we've got the answers. And most likely, if you're doing this, you've gone to college or seminary, you've got a graduate degree in some sort of theological study. So you know your stuff, and you want to give the answers. But really what will happen is if you get to the point where you're sharing truth and you're not doing it in partnership with locals, you've basically taken step 3, which is learn about their culture, and you've thrown it out the window. Yep. You're like, I did this once and now I'm done. No, you got to keep doing it, and you've got to keep learning their culture as you share truth, or you'll have an uncontextualized gospel that nobody will understand.
It's one of those great, we've talked about this before, but one of the great exercises we have to do in all cross-cultural mission work is to think of what you're doing in reverse. That if we use the example before, a young woman from South Korea that wants to come do work in America, how's that going to go? How's that going to be received? if she does the work of watching, all the Fast and Furious movies, and takes in the latest Little Mermaid, and is doing what she's trying to do to figure out who we are, and then comes in and tells us how we're doing everything wrong, that's not going to be received well. That's not going to create the kind of change that we want to see. And so the humility to say, I don't have this all figured out, chances are I never will, because this is such a continual process. And so if I have a prayer of the kind of impact that I'm hoping to see, it's going to be done hand in hand with the local people, if not led by the local people, to get this done. And like you said before, it goes back to believing in the power of the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit that's in me is just as much in others, and getting away from the inherent baked in pride of all mission work, which is that I'm coming with this thing that you don't have. I'm coming with my betterness to make a difference in your lack of betterness. That creates an inherently prideful dynamic that we constantly have to fight against.
And then we end up, I'll speak simply here, we end up scratching itches that they don't have. Like, we feel like there's things that need to be talked about because they need to be talked about in our culture, that either really it's not a problem there, or it doesn't make sense to them. We've talked about some like justice and versus honor, shame, or I think about like authority, and the way, like, I think as Americans become followers of Jesus, like submission to Jesus as the ultimate authority and king, like that's something that people have to get, because we don't do well at submitting to authority. But for example, in Latin America, you submit to authority. Like if someone's in authority, you submit to them. The problem isn't the submission to authority. The problem is you don't feel any intimacy with anybody in authority. So like the way we approach something as simple as like the authority of Jesus as our king, it's going to look different somewhere else. But we want to, anyway, the point is here, you got to work with other people so that you don't scratch itches that they don't have.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I've told the story on this podcast before, and I'll keep a real brief version of it. But one of the first teaching opportunities I ever had cross-culturally, went for about an hour and a half. I thought it was solid stuff. I thought it was making an impact. And when we got to the Q&A time afterwards, the very first question that somebody asked, which was not remotely related to anything I said or anything I've done, was about whether or not I believe that you can eat blood. Because, that's a real biblical controversy of the consumption of blood. And apparently in the local culture, it was also a big controversy and a hot topic. And that was one of the big questions that apparently been going around in this local community, is because there's local dishes that have coagulated blood in it, and whether or not you could consume that as a follower of Jesus. And not remotely on my radar, because it's not an issue that we deal with or we confront, but to them it was as hot topic as anything, and they wanted to know what I thought. And everything that I'd spent the last hour and a half teaching through didn't remotely address what was one of their most felt needs.
So there's kind of three questions you would want to ask as you speak truth in cooperation with them. The first one would be, what does it sound like? So here we're talking about the real practical stuff, like, is this linguistically accurate? Is your vocabulary, your vernacular, does this sound like something that a local would say? Especially if you're the one saying it. So again, in Peru, we plant the church. We can get people to come to church in Peru. And so I would preach most Sundays, and I ran, even after multiple years there, felt really comfortable with the language. We weren't taking language classes, except I paid my language teacher once a week. She'd come to our apartment, and I'd hand her my sermon and say, what do you do? What do you think? And that was so helpful, because she could, not only would she help with like shifting, again, turns, phrases that I might not know, or it might sound weird as I crafted it. But like illustrations, the stuff we talked about earlier, historical illustrations, like having somebody to help you communicate well, is just good. It's just wise. And it's going to help you contextualize better.
Yeah. And it's obviously, when we're dealing with language, that the local language is different than the language I speak, this stuff is pretty obvious, but it applies just as much even if you do speak the local language, because language has layers to it, and there's slang, and there's storytelling, and there's all these layers to stuff that even within a monocultural environment we deal with, the words that you choose and what those words mean. And we've mentioned this before, but even in American culture, the deep Christianese with which we speak where we use phrases and words that the rest of the culture doesn't. They're church words. And the more that we use church words, the more ostracizing that we become, the more we're making this an insider movement where, not in the good way, making an insider movement where if you're not a part of this insider thing, you're clearly not welcome or a part of this community.
Absolutely. Great point.
So the first question is, what does it sound like? What can we do in our language, vernacular, vocabulary, the values that we're communicating to say that this is for you? The second question is, what does it look like? We're talking about representation. We're talking about, do the people that we're working with see themselves as part of this thing? Do they see themselves welcomed as this thing? Do they see that this is for them? And I think, we're, especially when we talk about representation, we as our own unique Western American culture have some baggage here. This has become a bit of a politicized topic. And I think we kind of need to address that head on, that if we are working from a Western context, if that's our home area, representation, it's a mixed bag. And people are going to look at that term in a lot of different ways. But if we are part of the majority, which most of us are, because that's how the word majority works, we've got to recognize that we are not seeing the whole picture, and that we don't have the experiences that other people do. And there's a humility in just recognizing, I haven't seen things the way you have seen things, and so I'm going to allow for your voice to measure well. I'm going to allow for your voice to be true, even if it's not something that I don't understand, that I'm going to give you the trust and the honor to be able to do that. And so, I had a situation here locally where a person of color was describing what it meant to see another person of color on stage, and how until that point she believed that this church wasn't for her. And that's hard for me to hear, because it's like, why would you think this church isn't for you? Why would you come to that conclusion? I can immediately question it and think that there's ulterior motives behind it and believe that this is not a solid conclusion. But to be able to put that aside and say, you know what, I haven't walked the road that you have walked.
Yeah.
I haven't seen this culture the way that you have. If you tell me this is your experience and you tell me this is how you feel, I have to just accept that for what it is.
Which reminds me, as soon as possible, you want to sit down and not be the person. If there's a situation where somebody's up front talking, the outsider, as soon as is possible, the outsider shouldn't be the one who's up front talking. You want it to look like that local culture. And obviously, when things are just getting started, especially if it's a place where this is a new church plant, and you've got brand new people coming to faith in Jesus, that's going to take a little while. But making it look like a local culture means sometimes I got to sit down, I got to shut up and sit down as soon as there's someone who can take my spot, which is so different. If you grew up in an American church context, a local ministry person is trying to keep their job. But I think if you're in another culture, your goal is ultimately to work yourself out of a job. If you've done your job well, they don't need you because they've got locals who can do this thing.
Are you saying that missionaries should stop preaching, Matt? Is that what you're saying?
Ooh, maybe so. Turns out to make your job a lot easier. You wouldn't have to do all this language stuff, hard language stuff. You get somebody who actually knows the language to do it. I shouldn't go down this road, but I always loved when campaign groups would come from the United States.
You keep using that word campaign. Is that what you guys call your mission trips?
Yeah, we do.
Is campaigns?
Yeah.
I've never heard that word before. I've heard you say it several times in this podcast, campaign trips.
I think some kids, some folks would call it a mission trip. I don't like the word mission trip because it's like, I don't want some college student to go somewhere for a week and think that they've gone on a mission trip. I want them to know they've gone somewhere on a campaign. They've helped someone. They are not a missionary. Anyway, perhaps it's just missionary pride.
Look at you gatekeeping.
I know, right? I can't help it. But yeah, we call it campaigns, is what a lot of what we call these things. So
I've only thought of campaigns as like political campaigns. And so that's why the first couple of times you used that word, that threw me off. I'm like, oh, we're going to get somebody elected. Now this is really hairy.
Yeah, short-term campaign work. It's a lot of what we called it.
Okay.
Anyways, but I guess it's always funny to me when one of these like Americans will come and they want to speak. It's like, wait a second, you don't know we've spent again, maybe this is gatekeeping again. We spent the past 3 years learning the language, and you want to come in and like use a translator, or we've got Peruvians who can talk, and you want to come in and like speak in English and use a translator just because, anyway, there's a lot of pride, I think, with this sort of thing. And so we want things to look as local as possible in their representation.
And we need to pause and acknowledge that that is super hard. Mm-hmm. And that if you're in a situation, or I mean, yeah, I've been in this time before, looking at, missionary kids, your parents were in a situation where, your dad preached at a church in some other country for 25 years. We're not condemning you. We're not saying you did it wrong. We're not, that's not what is trying to happen here. We're just saying that in faith, in believing in the Holy Spirit, and believing that the Holy Spirit is the one making these things happen. I wish I had this Bonhoeffer quote on me about how Christ built the church. That we believe this is God's work, and we believe that this is in the Spirit of Christ, that things are done and accomplished and succeed. And that what that looks like is going to be different for everything in every place. And so when we believe in the power of the Holy Spirit to do the work instead of us, that we are much more ready to get out of the way. We're much more willing to let go. We're much more willing to release. And I know that that is hard if, you've raised tens of thousands of dollars to go to this place, and you've gone through all of your training, and you have your degrees, and you want all the work you've done to pay off. And oftentimes that payoff feels like I'm in charge and I'm the one doing the work. That you've got to just take that to Jesus, to be honest, and let him speak to you about what that means. I can say that when I look at scripture, Ephesians 4 is, I think, the most articulate way of saying this, is that when God gifts us to do things and allows us to play a role in his body, that there is a season, yes, where we are the primary doers of the things. But we quickly want to get out of that season to become the facilitator, to become the equipper, to be, as Ephesians 4 describes the offices of the church, as actually not the one who does those things, but the one who equips the people to do those things. And that's a hard transition to make, because you're not getting the glory, you're not getting the recognition, you're not, getting the serotonin rush of exercising your gifts. Instead, you're the behind the scenes person who's watching this happen through others. But I can also say that I have discovered a deeper satisfaction in that. I find, just like a parent, watching your kid play t-ball or whatever, there is a sense of pride and accomplishment by watching others succeed that is deeper and more satisfying than anything that you ever do yourself. And so, man, get the heck out of the way.
Yep. And it may take years. Like, it's okay to acknowledge this may take years. But that's what you're shooting for. And that's a great illustration. Like a proud, I think about Paul, like with the way he thinks of Timothy as a son in the faith. Here's an opportunity to be like a parent to somebody in the faith, and to see them like step up and lead God's people. That's beautiful. But you got to get out of the way to experience that.
And I think the parenting metaphor also works, that how that person that you're raising up is going to do it is they're going to do it differently than you, because they're going to have different reasons. Just like a parent, when you look at your child, like, why are you doing it this way? That they're going to do things differently, and you've got to, trust that the Holy Spirit's in charge and not you, and that this is going to be okay. It's the continual journey of release, of following Jesus, of learning to let go. And my advice would be, no matter where you are, no matter where you're going, to always look at this as nothing more than a season. This is a season of work. And so just like seasons change on a regular basis, you've got to be ready for that change and that transition. And so, is my season up? Because the thing that we rarely talk about in missions culture is the problems that happen when you don't let go, when you don't release, when you don't transition to local people and leadership, is that there's a lot of negative that occurs. There's a lot of stagnation. There's a lot of everything becomes about you and becomes on your shoulders, and that's not a good place for things to be.
No. And then on a really practical level, what if you have to leave? Like, what if you have to leave, does this community of believers survive? Or have you built this thing in a way that it's all about you, so that if you have to leave, it's going to fall apart? And that's happened many, many times.
Yes.
And so my favorite illustration of this is like as you build a building, if you build it with scaffolding, when the building is completed, what do you do with that scaffolding? You take it down, right?
Mhm.
Missionary
Hopefully.
ought to see themselves as scaffolding, so that when
Yeah.
you've, and you haven't done, but when God's built this thing, you can just remove the scaffolding, remove yourself from the situation, and this thing stands. But too many missionaries set themselves up as the center tent pole of a tent. And when you remove that tent pole, the center pole, the whole thing collapses. You don't want to do cross-cultural ministry in that way, so that everything collapses when you step away.
Although we have to name the elephant in the room is that when you are the tent pole, it's easier to raise money.
It is.
It is. But yeah. So the three questions are: what does it sound like? What does it look like? And that's leading to the third question, which we've dealt with a lot already, is who's in charge? What does leadership look like? And we're basing a lot of this on the Apostle Paul and how he handled his mission work, which was as quickly as possible. He handed it off to local leadership and he got it out of the way. Now, he still stayed on as an apostle. He's not abandoning people. He's continuing the network and communication and relationship that is involved with these local communities. But as far as decision making and what is contextualization going to happen, he leaves it up to the people to decide, and he leaves it locally in that place, and we need to do the same.
Yeah, he seems to, like, from our perspective, he appoints elders really quickly, especially in Acts chapter 14. Like, he's just gone through these cities, gets to the end of the road, and then goes back, and it's like he appointed elders in every city. And it's like, whoa, these are some likely, maybe there's some Jewish guys in here who've had a long relationship with faith, but this seems really quick. But I think it's an illustration of the point that we've got to hand this off as quickly as possible. Responsibly, but in a way that allows locals to lead this church, because the church is going to be more successful, spiritually successful in bringing other people to Jesus if locals are doing it, who know the culture.
Yeah, I mean that's I get hyperbolic about these things, and I recognize that, but the mantra that I've always tried to teach when it comes to raising up and training missionaries is the hard truth that here's where the statement begins: in the long run, the local people will always do it better. Mm-hmm. That when it comes to the immediate setup and first things, maybe not. I mean, you're hopefully there because something is not happening, but in the long run, the locals will always do it better. And we've got to be asking, how quickly are we letting that stage begin? Everybody's in a different place, and we're not saying there's one size fits all model for this, not in any way, but that we've always got to be looking in that direction. It's funny, you talk about short-term mission trips, that I've been on several myself, and I know many people who have, and how many times we've walked into situations in all different parts of the world where we go to a local Sunday morning service and we see a church that's operating out of the 1950s. I don't know if you've experienced that, where you go to some other place in the world. We're not talking about like, Southern Alabama. We're talking about like some other country, some other place, and you walk into a local church and it's like, yeah, a Baptist church from the 1950s. And it's this out of body experience of like, what is going on here? And if you peel back the layers and look at the history, what you always find is they go, well, this is what the missionary taught us to do. Mm-hmm. This is how the missionary explained what church is. And so we're just following what the missionary said decades after that missionary has left. Yeah. And that's part of what we have to recognize when we bring in the authority of the missionary, whether we recognize that authority or not. How we tell them to do stuff is how they're going to do it. And it's possible that that's how they're going to do it forever. Mm-hmm. And so contextualization is not happening because we haven't truly in a humble place said, I don't have the answers for this place. I'm not going to tell you how to do stuff. Let's work together to figure out how God is going to represent himself in this culture. Yeah. And even in the country of service that I lived forever, that country's got a really weird history of like the explosion of the local church. I worked there in a season of harvest. And the explosion of the local church happened as soon as the missionaries left, as soon as they, for political reasons, got kicked out. That's when the church really got its groove. And I'm not saying that's going to be the case in every country. I'm not saying, the solution to God's global work is to remove all missionaries. Don't take this way farther than I'm saying it, because I'm not. Yeah. But there is one testimony of one country where things really took a whole nother level when the missionaries got out of the way.
Yeah. And we don't want to hear that, but it's absolutely the case. And Yeah. So we ready for number 5? Are we ready for the last point of the last episode?
It's short.
It is
Let's do it.
short. Okay.
Number 5.
So,
Go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Number 5 is we've talked a lot about change. It's internal change, it's external change, it's this continual adapting and molding to God being local. And number 5 is just be ready to change again, because this is a never-ending process. Never settle, never arrive, never put the last dot on the last sentence and say this work is done, but continually be open to change, be open to what's next, realize that this process is never done.
Which is the key to what you just said a minute ago, where you go into a place and it looks like an American church from the 1950s in a far off place in another culture. The key to preventing that is to teach the locals. As you disciple people, you've got to disciple them about contextualization. That they know that this is an ongoing process, and that it's now their job, as you hand this thing off, it's their job to continue adapting this, because this process is never done.
Yeah, culture is never static. Culture is always shifting and moving and manifesting itself in different ways. And if we're not conveying those principles and those realities, things get stuck. We got to remember that what today we call traditionalism, what today we call people being stuck in their ways, was at once a cutting edge contextualization. We've talked about Sunday night church before.
Yeah,
that's one of those hard things that if you cut Sunday night church programming, people lose their minds because you don't love Jesus anymore. And what we look at as an old, outdated tradition that is pulling the church down, at one point was a brand new cutting edge ministry program idea that was going to light the world on fire, because that's just how time works. And so if we stop trying to change, stop trying to be ready for what's next, we congratulate ourselves too much for our success, and we're not willing to let go of what was once a cool thing to make room for what's next, then
and it's as simple as asking, how can we be a biblical and relevant church in 2023? The problem is you've got to keep asking that question, because you got to ask it again in 2024 and 2025, and it's an ongoing process. And we've talked about churches in the United States that have struggled with this. Churches that stop contextualizing will go into the process of decreasing dramatically in numbers, and eventually they will die. Or they may maintain for a long time, but it's down to just the older people and the families that have stuck around. But if you don't continue this process, churches will die. And that's true in any culture. Like, if the people who begin, like the locals, if they don't do this, they don't contextualize, if they just do what you did as the missionary, then that church will eventually die out. I think that puts a heavy responsibility on the missionary to actually train people, like give people permission to do this. You may have to say it out loud. You do not have to do things just like I've done. I'm going to train you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to disciple you, but you've got to at some point take the keys and take some ownership of this. But it's going to take training. My professor and my main professor during my doctoral studies would tell the story of the Panama Canal, and how there came this point at which the United States handed over obviously there's some colonialism and all this stuff there, but eventually the folks in Panama said, this is our country, this is our canal, we want to do this. And so they had this big ceremony where they officially handed over the keys to the Panamanians. And then the next day, the Panamanians handed the key back and said, you've got to tell us how to do this now. They were not ready to run the Panama Canal. So boy, we've got some serious training and discipleship to do as we help people, but ultimately we want to hand them the keys so that they can do this in their own ways, in their own culture.
Yeah, I think we could use the easy metaphor of building a church, that your goal as a missionary is not to build the church and hand over the keys. That's not what we're talking about. Your job as the missionary is to show up at the local place and with the local people the whole time ask the same questions. Where should we place this church? How do we acquire land? What kind of building materials? What is this like? When problems arise of what do we do, continually turn that back to them and say, what do you think we should do? What makes sense to you? How have that humble place to say, I am here to serve Christ in whatever way and shape or form that needs to be.
Yeah.
But this is your place. This is your church. This is your mission.
Yeah.
Help me understand.
you end up in a situation like the Panama Canal where
Right.
we went in, we built a canal on our own, and then when it was like, okay, we're to you, they weren't ready. Like
Yeah.
the key to handing something over is for it to never have been your own in the first place. You have, from the beginning, as you've just said, it's been a community where you've constantly been in cooperation with locals.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole history of colonialism there as well, where countries came into underdeveloped countries and built roads and schools and hospitals and then left. And then they're like, look what they did when we did that. Look how they destroyed this stuff. It's like, because you never involved them in the whole time.
Yeah.
You never showed them how to do these things or what the benefit of it. You never involved them. You just went in and copied and pasted your stuff, walked away, and you're surprised that it didn't work. It's from day one, step one, that humble posture and spirit. One of the best language teachers I ever encountered said, if you're going to learn the language, you got to be ready to look like a fool.
Yeah.
And it's no different in learning how to do mission, that you got to be ready to look like the fool. And not only will that be more effective in the long run, it'll also be endearing to the local people. They will find a different way to accept you and a different way to work with you. And that's a big deal.
So I want to honor those of our listeners that are thinking about doing some cross-cultural stuff. Thank you for being willing to look like a fool.
Yeah.
Because you're most likely if this is something you're about to do, you're about to give up some successful career in the United States where people look up to you, and you're about to go somewhere and sound like a 3-year-old. And you're going to look like a fool, but boy, I think God is honored by that. Turns out that's what the gospel is sort of all about, isn't it? Some foolishness.
Yeah, I mean, take Philippians 2. Our attitude should be the same as Christ Jesus, who did not consider, and fill in the blank with did not consider a house and 2 cars, did not consider your advanced degrees, did not consider your 401k, something to hold on to, but instead emptied himself. What is that for you? What does that place look like? This is the journey of following Jesus, is continually releasing, letting go. In the end, that's the great irony of learning to let go and release, is you get to hold on to Jesus more as you get rid of the things that you don't need. And often those things are positions and titles and respect and authority.
Nobody got more stuff, had a better life, and was like, oh, this made me more like Jesus.
Yeah.
Or this helped me to be closer. No. When we suffer, that's when, and we always look back and like, oh yeah, that was the time that I grew. When I gave something up, when I was forced to sacrifice, when I chose to sacrifice, or when I went through something I didn't want to go through. That's when Christ shaped me the most into his image. Nobody took a vacation to Hawaii and was like, oh wow, now I'm more like Jesus. But I mean, I still want to go to Hawaii someday, but I don't expect that it'll help me to become more like Jesus. It'll just be fun.
Final thoughts as we wrap up this entire season. If I could lean into hyperbole a little bit, I would say my final thought is contextualize or die.
Wow, that's heavy.
It's that simple. I mean, it's whether we're talking about a local church, whether we're talking about a denomination, whether we're talking about a missions movement, if it is not incarnate, to use the model of Christ, if it is not a local thing, then it's only going to last for a season. And so you are choosing that season to be short if it's not a local thing lived in a local way.
That's so serious and a great way to end, but like I'm picturing in my mind a meme with your face and skull bones that says contextualize or die.
Yeah.
That could be our graphic if we ever do this again. Like,
yeah, we can put that on the season 2 graphic.
Contextualize or die. But you're right. This is about the glory of God's going to be glorified no matter what. But we want to see local churches and local communities across the world not just survive but thrive. And that will not happen if we're not serious about contextualization.
Yeah. One of my favorite passages in scripture is John 1, where it describes what the incarnation is and what it looks like. And I especially like Eugene Peterson's paraphrase where he said, God moved into the neighborhood. It's that localization of what Jesus is. And as we started out episode 1 here, that Jesus is the ultimate example of contextualization, of this Trinitarian God that is a great mystery, choosing to empty himself and fill human flesh so that he could be understood. That's the task of contextualization. And as followers of Jesus, as imitators of Christ, we are called to the same thing.
Absolutely. This has been fun.
It has. Matt, thanks. I've enjoyed our time together.
We're gonna hope our listeners have enjoyed it a little bit.
Yeah.
Continue to episode 10. Maybe they don't hate our guts completely.
Yeah, I hope not. We're going to spend a season dreaming, and we're going to spend some season resting from making a podcast. That's the first thing. And then we're going to dream and talk about what a podcast on popular missiology would look like for season 2. If any of you out there have ideas or things you'd want, we'd love to hear that feedback, because we really don't have a plan for season 2, but we'll make some stuff. And I almost hesitated to say anything on this, that it's entirely possible between season 1 and season 2 I'll have some random inspiration for a bonus episode, and there's a possibility that something gets thrown out there. No promises, no commitments, but we'll see.
Bonus episode.
Who knows? Who knows? Who's to say?
We haven't talked
These are
about
possible
this,
things.
but that'd be
Yeah,
fun. We'll see.
yeah, we'll see. All right. Thank you guys for listening. This is the end of season 1 of Missio Pop.